Hey, my name's Sam, and today I'm moving to this new workshop. The footage you're about to see was shot back in July of 2021. I had lost my shop during the pandemic lockdowns and had to put all my tools in storage. After 16 months of searching for a new shop, I happened to come across this new makerspace that just opened up. I was able to rent a designated space, but also being able to use the community wood shop. This is where we pick up as I move in and set up the new shop by myself. Let's begin. So I'm terrible at asking for help. When I found this new shop, I knew I'd be doing this move on my own. The days leading up, I did some prep work to make moving day a little easier for myself. Now, there are some tools that are going to be annoying to move no matter what, this drill press being a prime example of that. For everything else, my first tip for you is to put anything possible on wheels. In this case, I made a crude but simple base for my lathe so I can roll it around with ease. But the only problem is that it moves too easily. So, my second tip for you is to add some locking casters so it won't roll away. Since I couldn't hold the lathe and hit the switch at the same time, I thankfully was able to get a helping hand. And from here on, I can continue to load everything on my own, one piece at a time, since everything else is on wheels. A drum sander is another top-heavy tool. Thankfully, it had locking casters built in. That way I'm able to lock it in place so I can move around it to operate the switch. And up I go. So by now you might have figured out my third and most important tip for moving on your own. That is to rent a truck with a liftgate on it. Without it, it'd be impossible to move all these tools by yourself. Just be safe and make sure everything is secure before operating the lift. With all my wheeled items packed, I can now walk over my drill press, as one does, then lift it on up and strap it to the wall so it won't tip over. Off camera, I did lock and strap all the previous tools down as well. My next tip is to move your cabinets without the drawers installed, at least if you're doing this on your own. It's just easier to move everything around without the extra weight. And since I only had one furniture dolly, in order to move my workbench, I just had to lift and pull it from one side. I made sure everything was secure and closed up the truck. From there, I started my drive towards downtown, of course, sitting through that famous Los Angeles traffic. After arriving to the new workshop, I can begin to unload, except this time I had some unexpected help. This is Omar. He's the founder of this new makerspace. With his help, it did go by a lot faster. Thanks, Omar. Now, this liftgate was seriously the MVP of this whole move. Later on in the video, I'll talk more about how you can rent one yourself. But with it, we can lower my workbench down, and maybe next time I'll invest in another furniture dolly. Another thing that helped was this rolling cart. It made moving static items so much easier, but you definitely need a helping hand lifting larger items. So far up until this point, this move had been going pretty smoothly, but we had our first tragedy. Trigger warning for those who are squeamish. But seriously, Omar did fracture his ankle and try to play it off.
Did you hurt yourself? Yeah, I did.
So for the next pro tip is not to jump off the truck. Your ankles will thank you later. At this point, he went to go rest, and I went back to being solo for a bit. Now, this cabinet I'm bringing in is actually a router table, but when we were first setting up the shop, we decided to also use it as an outfeed table for the table saw, just for the time being, until I can build a proper one. Omar was a champ for still wanting to help me after injuring himself. I believe it was at this point he really started to feel the pain. With the truck almost empty, the lathe was next. With it being pretty top heavy and having no locking casters, this was the one tool I needed a hand with. The only thing remaining was the drill press, and while I walk it over, let's talk about this truck rental. I rented this truck directly from Penske for 24 hours. From their website, you have to email and request a truck with the liftgate. The good thing is that you do not need a commercial license to drive this truck and can just use a standard license. At the time of this rental, I paid $150 for 24 hours, which is well worth it in my opinion. I'm not sure if the price has gone up since then, but I'll leave the link in the description below if you're interested. So here's a space. It's still completely in the works. Still being made, still being set up. But here it is. It's gonna be my bay. From here, I built a lumber rack on the brick wall between my cabinets. Making a rack that could support the weight on brick was actually pretty tricky and required a lot of research. If you want to see how I did it and what made it possible, I've linked the video I made in the description below. With the lumber wall complete, I can now start to set up my space. In this makerspace, I have a designated area that I can set up however I want. Under the lumber rack, I want to make a long work table and tool wall. So I set the two cabinets apart and made sure they were level and at the same height. I measured the distance between the cabinets and the depths of the cabinets themselves. Then made a simple frame to connect the two cabinets together. I set it in place with a 3/4 inch offset so that the top piece can be flush with the cabinets, and then screwed it in place. I cut some scrap plywood for the top, but since the distance was more than 48 inches in width, I had to cut a small strip to fill the gap. With that in place, I screwed everything down. I ran the cable for this industrial power strip behind the cabinet before continuing and installed it underneath the table. Plain plywood isn't the best work surface for doing glue-ups or for easy cleaning, so I'll be using melamine for the top. The factory edges aren't usually the cleanest, so I'm cutting it oversized. I then can flip it over and ride the clean side against the fence as I cut it to final size, giving me two clean edges. After setting it in place, I check to see if there's any low spots, and then put any shims that may be necessary. And since the bench is over 8 feet long, I needed to cut an additional piece to fill in the gap. Off camera, I did screw everything in place from the bottom, leaving me with a clean surface. When I installed the lumber rack, I did so high enough where my head wouldn't bump into it. To utilize this space, I'm cutting a piece of plywood to attach to the studs. And as I mentioned before, using the router table as outfeed support. After centering it to the work table, I mark the stud locations, and then finally, I can drill it in place. With the work table against the wall complete, it's now time to figure out how to set up the middle of my space. I wanted a table to work on and that I can access all four sides of, but I had some restrictions. One, I needed it quick. I had some builds lined up that I was eager to start. So I didn't want to spend a lot of time building a crazy nice assembly table like this one from John Malecki. Maybe in the future, I might invest my time to build one, but not now. Two, I didn't want to break the bank buying an expensive one. Even with these, they might be nice, but they don't suit my needs. Three, it needed to be sturdy and not wobble around. I could build a simple 2x4 workbench, but in my experience, those always seem to have some side-to-side wobble. Nothing against them, like this one from Brad at Fix This Build That. This is probably great to work on, but if I'm going to take the time and effort to make one, I want to make it really nice. And like I mentioned earlier, I don't really have the time for that right now. So with that in mind, you're probably going to be surprised with the option I chose to go with, and that is boltless shelving. You're probably thinking, what the heck, really? Well, they're made for storage and can support the weight. They don't wobble, they come in a variety of sizes and are configurable. I bought mine used off Facebook Marketplace for $50, but new, they're still cheaper than other workbenches, and they're super quick to assemble.
With my $50 shelves purchased, I can load it into my space, separating all the pieces. The only problem buying it used is that you can't customize it and are limited to configurations that people have listed. In my case, it's too tall, so I plan on cutting it down. Each side has pairs that go with one another, so after matching the pairs and marking my desired height, I can bring it over to the metal cutting saw. And after putting on my PPE, I can make the cut. Whenever you cut on the metal saw, it always leaves a sharp burr on the edges, so I give the fresh edge a quick sanding with some 40 grit. Assembling the shelving unit is real easy. I place the corners down and begin to hammer the brackets in on each side, doing one layer at a time. Assembling the table took less than 30 minutes, and in total, an hour including cutting the legs down. With the table complete, I can load it up with my shortcut lumber. Even though I do have a lumber rack, I'm mainly using that to keep all the drums I make off the floor. But for my exotic lumber, I want to keep that separate, like this coco bolo, or for the really long pieces of lumber. I will store those on the top shelf of my lumber rack. I set my small workbench in the front of my space and put all my F-clamps on the side for quick access.
Before we continue, let me address the elephant in the room. You might have noticed my assembly table looks a little different now compared to what I just showed you. That was filmed over 2 years ago. I did use the assembly table as it was, and it worked great. You'll see that in some of my upcoming build videos. But I always knew it would be a temporary solution since I was in a time constraint back then. I knew I wanted to make it bigger so I can work on larger builds. So some time between now and then, I made these two simple cabinets to widen it using some offcut plywood. I matched the height of the table, leaving room for some leveling feet. After making sure the two pieces were level with one another, I cut another piece of melamine for the top. So far, I haven't experienced any sagging, and as you can see, the melamine has held up after some heavy use. So if you decide to venture into using boltless shelving as your assembly table, just know you can modify it like I did.
Back to the plywood wall, I screwed in a small shelf and some plywood ledges for my most used items. This includes some PPE, a steric combination square, some Type-On 2, and some super glue. A new addition to my toolset is a Jimmy DeResta razor blade. On the other side of the wall, I wanted to display some artwork and what I'm calling the Maker Drumhead. On this drumhead are people that have inspired me that I've had the pleasure to meet. I wouldn't be starting this YouTube channel if it wasn't for the encouragement that I received from a lot of these people. Thank you for the inspiration.
I love the making community and the people in it. That's another reason why I joined this makerspace here in Los Angeles. To work alongside other creative people that have a passion for making is refreshing. So let me give you a quick tour of the facility. This place has a full wood shop that all members have access to after safety training. This includes 2 saw stops, 2 bandsaws, a jointer and planer, and more. This includes some of the tools that I brought in and a slew of basic power tools. Also available to members are a laser cutter and a benchtop CNC. As a member, you can use the community tables for whatever you're building, but another option is to be a resident with your own designated space. There are several residents, including me. This is my completed space that you just saw me set up. I've been using it for the last few years and it's been working great. I upgraded my lathe last year, which is a huge improvement from the last one. The community woodshop layout has changed since I moved in, and the dust collection ended up right next to my bay. So to separate me from them as much as I could, I put up these partitions. Lastly, I made this raised letter sign. I run this furniture business and I have a small drum company called Muro drums. I use the same M logo for both. So for me, it makes sense to display my logo for any clients that may stop by. If you want to see how I made the sign, I've linked the video in the description below. That's it for this video. If you want to see what I'll be making next, please consider subscribing. Thanks for watching.